Welcome back, everyone, to Biblio Files, a show from the Ann Arbor District Library in Michigan that's all about books. Each episode, we look at one book-related question and choose a book that fits that criterion. This time, we're looking at cli-fi or climate fiction. My name is Christopher, and I'm joined as always by Amanda and Lucy, and we have a special guest today, Marissa. So, Amanda, what did you pick for us this time?
So I didn't know what to choose for this one. So I decided to look at some different cli-fi book reading lists online. And I settled upon a few and I went with the first fold that came in for me. And I absolutely loved this book. It is called Slight Fidelity, written by Claire Boyles. I don't know if you are familiar with this one. And it is actually a collection of short stories. And I know nothing else about this author or what she has written, but the book is amazing. It's really, really great. I'm really glad that I happened upon it for this. But the book is a set of short stories. As I've said, I think there's around 10 in there, and some of them are interconnected. But it opens with a Rachel Carlson quote, which is always a good sign if you want to read something about the environment. But the story, the focus, they're all set out west, and they're all short stories. Some of them are interconnected, but they all follow really, really strong women trying to live their lives out west. And they're all sort of wrapped around the idea of something that's happening to the environment, be it water scarcity or fracking or endangered animals. But they also are struggling living their daily lives. You've got, birds are disappearing from the world. They've got men disappearing from their lives, and they're just trying to live their lives. But they are these strong women who are just trying to do what they can to get by. But they want to protect the environment, and they care about the environment, and they want to protect their families. So it's this interesting, interwoven. And it sounds kind of odd when I'm saying it, but in the book, it just makes sense to have these wonderful women who are trying to care for their families, but also being conscientious of what's happening in the environment. So these women, these strong, amazing women living out west, the writing is really amazing. It's really mesmerizing the way the words are put together. It's sort of like poetic. And when I started reading it, I didn't know that some of them were interconnected. So when some of the same characters were popping up again, I was like, oh, good, we get more information about that set of sisters. And maybe I'll find out what happened to them and what happened to the baby. So I really, really enjoyed that about the book. So it's gentle, it's soothing, but it's gritty, and it's emotional. It makes you think about the world that you set up for yourself and for your family, but also the world that you are living in and how you are leaving it and what was left to us. And how does the environment and the land around you connect to your own personal connection with the land, and how is your family tied to it? In one of the stories, there's a woman whose dad has been a rancher for 60 years. So how do you connect with how do you change the environment around you, and how does that larger change end up impacting the area you live in as a whole, but also the country you're in, and then the earth itself. So anyways, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, phenomenal writing. And that is my very brief and odd description of Slight Fidelity by Claire Boyles. Lucy, what cli-fi did you bring to the table today?
So I read a new-ish book, actually very new, written in 2022 by a woman named Rebecca Sherm. And the name of the book is called The House Between Earth and the Moon. And it is a novel that is set in 2033. And wildfires have intensified all over the world. In North America, they have these heat blocks that kind of literally cook people alive. It's like heat and fire surrounds a town. Ranging all over the US. Like in this book, the most recent ones are in Indiana and Ohio. So there are four different sort of points of view in this story. And the first one is this scientist who actually lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And his name is Alex Welch Peters. And he's been working for 20 years to create this algae that will eat the carbon out of the environment and help everybody. But he is being sent to a space station called Parallaxis 1. And this is being created by these sort of tycoons who want to create a space for the small number of investors in this space station to escape what is happening on Earth. So basically, this is like a few billionaires, a handful of billionaires will get away from the horrible devastation that's happening because of climate change. So he's sent up to that space station along with some other scientists. There are a couple astronauts, but mostly it's not people who know anything about space. And it's kind of interesting what they find when they get there. So the company that is developing it is this tech conglomerate called Census. And Census also runs everyone's tech, and phones at this point are pretty much like a given. And it's almost just like a constant read, and a feed, so that you don't even have to do anything to get the information. It's like a screen, basically. And another point of view in the story is Alex's daughter, Mary Agnes, who's left behind with his wife, Meg, and his son, Shane. And Mary Agnes is a teenager. So we also have this teenager navigating this world of social media and being a teenager with this constant screen and like constant manipulation of images and all the things that are happening now. But can you imagine if everyone had less control over that? So she gets in a little trouble there. And there's a whole piece about like cyberbullying and screen addiction, and which doesn't directly relate to the climate, but because it's all these changes that are taking place are just a piece of the larger issue. The biggest issue here is the climate. So then we have another woman who is sort of a reader of the information that people are getting. She's naive about what her job is. It's called Views. And so she essentially gets to watch through everyone else's eyes what they are seeing. So she's sent to the space station. The scientist's family also goes to the space station. There's a few other families, and they're building it. It's in horrible condition. It's not at all like it's been sold. And the whole time they're there, they're hearing about what's happening with the climate on Earth. And these scientists feel awful because what they want to do is help fix climate change on Earth. But all they're doing is creating a livable environment in space for a few investors. So that just felt really relevant. Like, who has the money to get away from the harm that's been done? Who's going to invest in change on Earth? And so it's this really great going back and forth between the people who are still on Earth and the people in space. And it doesn't feel sci-fi. It feels very realistic and possible. It's interesting. One of the reasons this family lives in Michigan is because they went there. It's kind of like that's going to be the place where climate refugees go. And every aspect of this book really touches on privacy and the lack of privacy. The beginning of this book, you see that the Supreme Court has ruled that privacy is a commodity, not a right. So it's for sale, essentially. And I loved this book because I felt like the author was showing us this weird world in space that could be very possible, but without any of the glamour. Like, things are falling off. When they are in their room where they're eating without gravity, eventually the walls in this room get kind of dewy because they get coated with saliva particles. Because if you think about it, if you're eating in a room with no gravity, or the things they haven't thought of, like the air duct system works really well, except when it gets clogged by human hair, which is floating. So like these amazing little details. But the climate piece is really at the heart of this book, because there's literally this scorched earth that these people are trying to get away from. And it has a sort of thriller aspect to it, because you don't really know what's going to happen with the creation of this. And are the people who are working on this space station going to stay on track and do what they're supposed to do? Or are they going to do the better thing, really? So there's all these little interesting pieces, space tourism as an idea, sort of big tech is in there. So she really threw a lot in there. And it was really interesting to be reading right now when you hear about like, wow, the East Coast is unusually warm. And the author got her MFA at University of Michigan. And that's where she was living at the time when she started this book. and she got pregnant, and that's what made her think about what is the world that we're creating for our kids. And it seemed sort of abstract in Michigan. And then she moved from Michigan to California. And the way she describes it is she got thrown into the belly of the beast. And that's just sort of like sent this book spiraling. So that is a sort of very roundabout way of describing how this book was climate fiction. But it was a lot of other things. And it was certainly hard to put down. Like, I just tore through it. So I highly recommend it. Again, that's The House Between Earth and the Moon by Rebecca Sherm. Marissa, what did you pick?
So I picked a book called Tentacle by Rita Indiana, which is such a cool name. It's very short. It's only 132 pages. It was the winner of the 2017 Grand Prize of the Association of Caribbean Writers. So it's set in the Dominican Republic, and it's very short, but it has so much stuff in there. It sort of follows this young sex worker turned maid who finds herself at the heart of this Santeria prophecy that she has to go back in time and save the ocean. It's in this future, it's the near future. I don't know if they say a year, but there was some sort of ecological disaster, pollution, or a weapon was set off, and basically the ocean died. There's no fish, which obviously being set in the Dominican Republic, like the ocean is a huge source of life for most people. So it's about poverty. There's refugees coming through. The wealth inequality is very obvious. And so then there's this Santeria prophecy and this Yoruba ritual, which takes place with the help of a magic sea anemone. As the ocean dies, ocean life becomes a commodity and kind of these rare animals that are kind of kept as pets. So there's the sea anemone. So with the Santeria and the Yoruba, you're getting like hints at Dominican politics and colonialism. And there's all this different stuff about race and gender in there. The main character, when they're introduced, they are a female and they have always wanted to go through gender affirming surgery. So there's this not magic, there's a science drug. It's called Rainbow Bright. And so it's sort of like, that's how they're convinced to do this ritual, is they're being paid in this, this drug. And so then they go back in time and they exist in the present and at the past at the same time. And so it's this very like human conundrum of the present is terrible. You go back to a better past, and do you stick your neck out and work to change the future? Or do you kind of just enjoy this beautiful life that you always wanted where things are good? And then there's also kind of the paradox of, if I still exist in both the present and the past now, if I change the past, will I kill myself in the future? Like, will I cease to exist? What happens? So it's like, it's so short, it's dizzying, and very satisfying in a way, and also horrible. There's a lot going on in this book, but it's so short. I read this in like one afternoon, but I highly recommend it. Tentacle by Rita Indiana. So Christopher, what did you read?
Well, it's interesting. I'm hearing so many familiar themes and ideas from all of you that were also reflected in my book. Before I chose the book that I'm talking about today, I saw so many horrible worlds to live in, looking at the dystopian shelf at AADL. But I finally chose this book called American War by Omar El-Akkad. I had never heard of this book. I'm so glad that I found it. It's written so well. And some of the books I picked up and tried, I didn't really like that much. This book, I absolutely loved. It tells the story of the Second American Civil War, starting around 2074, so about 50 years in the future. And it follows really the story of one girl as she grows up during the Second American Civil War, her life, her family, and it's also a reflection of what's happening in her community and in the country as a whole. The cli-fi part of the book is because the waters have risen in the ocean. Many of the coastal areas have been inundated and flooded. She was born in Louisiana, and so her family is moving north. The Midwest is also a center for coastal migrants, and she wants to get to the north with her family. Her father is killed, and the family ends up settling into a camp. The camp suffers a massacre by the North because this civil war has broken out. And it's partly broken out because the country has declared no more fossil fuels, while some of the southern states are still clinging to that life, the fossil fuel life. So that's one of the reasons that they have seceded from the country. But there's a massacre at this camp, and she becomes more determined to take her revenge on the North. She becomes a sniper and eventually assassinates a high-ranking Northern general. And she is later arrested, and she's held at a military detention center in what used to be Florida, but now is an island archipelago. She is tortured. She's tortured with waterboarding. She admits to all kinds of things that she never did. She's eventually released, and she decides to take her final revenge by releasing a poison virus, and which kills another 110 million people. This whole story is told through her nephew, who's also a character in the book, but he's reflecting back on this past in the US as a professional historian. So the book is this girl's whole narrative, her life, as well as some kind of reports and scientific documents and journal articles scattered throughout the book. If it sounds a little action-packed and hokey, it is absolutely not. It is very nuanced. It's very, very realistic. It's pretty depressing. When I say it's realistic, it's because everything seems so familiar. There are climate refugees. There are foreign powers meddling in the affairs of another country. In this case, it's foreign up-and-coming empires meddling in the US's civil war to try to destabilize things. And at one point, one of the characters says, "We don't even care who's on top or who's winning. We just want to keep things destabilized," which might sound familiar if you've studied US foreign relations. There is currency devaluation. There's packing late at night and trying to hurry out of areas. There's uncertainty about whether a war will come to your region or not. There's terrorism. So there is so much packed into this story. It's really gripping. I would say it's depressing, but it just is so realistic. So it's just the fact of there's really not a right and wrong in this. People's family members are murdered and people want to take revenge. So I love the politics and the family dynamics behind this. It's a great book. So that is American War by Omar El-Akkad. And does anyone have any last comments? We can end on a positive note if anyone has anything happy to say.
Well, I will say I read that book, Christopher, when it came out, and it was one of the first books that made me think about actually climate fiction as a genre and the idea of like climate refugees in this country, like when that starts to expand, what that looks like. So it's interesting because I almost went back and picked that book. So I was like, this is the book that kind of got me, thinking about this. So I'm so glad that you did, because it's also so well written. That book is just, I don't know if anyone else read it, but
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And one more thing about climate fiction that I'm thinking as I'm listening to all of us talk is that, it's interesting there are so many books about it now, and we're reading so much about it. And I wonder if it's almost like this way to read about what could happen and then look around and see what is happening. And to end on a hopeful note, maybe being able to see the difference between those two things when we read this will and when other people read it or people write it, will create some action. So that would be a hope.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I want to give a special thank you to our guest, Marissa, today, too. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's everything from Bibliophiles today. We would love to know what you're reading, whether it's climate fiction or anything else. You can leave a comment in the link below. Until next time, happy reading.